Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guest today is Nina Jankowicz. Nina is the Disinformation Fellow for the Science and Technology Innovation Program at the Wilson Center, but she joins us in a different capacity today. She's the author of a new book called How to Lose the Information War: Russia, Fake News, and the Future of Conflict, or Future Conflicts. Nina, welcome. Congratulations on the completion of the book.
Thank you very much. It's been a long road. It feels good that it's out.
Well, just in time to start the sequel. I mean, I think.
Let's not get ahead of ourselves, John.
Well, let's go back in time instead of looking forward and talk about the origins of the book. How did you find yourself immersed in this field where it has led to the publication of this book?
Sure. So the idea for the book came about when I was living and working in Ukraine as part of a Fulbright Fellowship, the Fulbright Public Policy Fellowship. And for a year, I was advising the Ukrainian government on strategic communications, in particular, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I worked with the spokesperson there. So I found myself on the front lines of the information war at a time when it couldn't have been more pertinent. It was the 2016 election cycle that I experienced from Ukraine. Certainly gave me a lot of perspective about what the United States was going through. And as all of these revelations about Russian electoral interference came to light, it seemed to me that the West, and especially the United States, were trying to reinvent the wheel with our response. We were shocked that it had happened to us. Of course, you know, we in the Russia Watcher space in particular had been aware of attacks on Estonia and some other countries that have dealt with cyber warfare and information warfare before. But for some reason, we were taken aback that it happened to us. And so I decided that it was really important to tell the stories of the nations that had gone through this before us, because in many cases, they had been trying responses, some more successful than others, for about a decade. And as we, you know, head into yet another election cycle where very little has changed, I think there are a lot of pertinent lessons for the United States and our Western allies in terms of combating disinformation.
I want to ask you about some of those failures and what we could learn from them. But before then, two points of order. One is I want to talk a bit about terminology. You make a point in the book that people will use terms interchangeably: propaganda, fake news, information war, influence operations, disinformation, misinformation. It's a big list. How do you discipline yourself when thinking about these things?
Sure. So I try to be really precise. Disinformation, and I know you and I have talked about this on your program before, is the use of false or misleading information with malign intent. Often, especially folks in the media, will try to interchangeably use that with misinformation, and that's incorrect. Misinformation does not have that malign intent. It's somebody who's sharing false or misleading information, but doesn't really know why they're doing it, right? They don't have that intent behind it. Propaganda is a little bit different because that is one nation or state or government trying to put its worldview onto other nations. So a good example of that right now is what the Chinese government is doing with relation to coronavirus, trying to absolve itself of blame, trying to paint a picture of the Chinese government as, you know, a medical savior, a producer of aid, et cetera. That's different than what Russia does, because Russia is trying to exploit many different sides of the political spectrum. Sometimes they're not, you know, necessarily conducive or supportive of Russian foreign policy and the Russian worldview, but the point is to pit us against each other. So Russia is no longer, I would say, just engaging in propaganda. And then, you know, fake news is in the subtitle of my book. I actually pushed back with my publisher a little bit on that because I don't think fake news in this political environment is a particularly helpful term. We've seen President Trump use that to describe any news that he finds politically inconvenient. And certainly a lot of leaders around the world have kind of taken that to heart. We have Duterte in the Philippines, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Kaczynski in Poland, Orban in Hungary, who have used the term fake news to kind of denigrate their political adversaries. So I don't find it to be a helpful term anymore. And I think we need to be a lot more precise about that. And then, you know, in terms of what is in the Russian information operations toolkit, there's a lot of things. There's disinformation, right? There's cyber attacks. There's also the use of funneling money and money laundering, supporting political parties, supporting fake NGOs. All of that I put under the bigger information or influence operations umbrella. And that's kind of the pyramid rather that I use to organize my own thoughts.
And then the goal of all of this, here's what you write: unlike Soviet propaganda, which sought to promote a specific communist-centric worldview, the Kremlin divides and deceives populations around the world with one goal in mind: the destruction of Western democracy as we know it.
Yeah.
These are high stakes.
They are. I always say, and this is something that I think is very, fitting with the Wilson Center's mission of nonpartisan policy analysis. Disinformation knows no political boundaries, knows no political party. Ultimately, the victim is democracy, and that is why we need a bipartisan, or indeed nonpartisan, solution to this problem. We need everyone to recognize that it's a threat, and everyone to recognize that by engaging in some of these tactics, which we've seen politicians in the United States do recently, we are opening ourselves up to further manipulation.
So you chronicle 5 cases and you look at failures. What are the best takeaways in terms of getting it right or getting it better the next time around?
Well, I think one really important takeaway is that our governments need to recognize that this is a threat, which I was just mentioning. I think this is not something I really anticipated coming to light, but it did during the time I was writing the manuscript. There are cases in the book, for instance, the Republic of Georgia, in Poland, even in the Czech Republic, 3 countries that really have a clear-eyed understanding of what Russia can do. And what Russia has done. They've occupied 20% of Georgia. The Czech Republic's experience with the Soviet Union during communist times was not too pretty, and the Polish-Russian relationship has been fraught for many, many centuries. And yet, even though in their national security doctrine, they label Russia a threat, by employing disinformation tactics on their own population domestically, these governments are undermining their own work. So that is a really important takeaway that I think is extremely pertinent to the US situation right now. Secondly, all of these countries recognize, the ones that are more successful anyway, recognize that they need to invest in people in order to solve this problem. So it's not just about playing whack-a-troll. It is not just about, sanctioning Russia or diplomatic maneuvering. It is about things like media literacy and civics and digital literacy to heal the fissures in our societies that Russia exploits. So that's another really huge takeaway. And then the third takeaway, which is something that I think we've a little bit lost sight of here in the United States. We tend to think of Russian operations as, bots and trolls, fake accounts on the internet. That's another reason I hate the term fake news. Actually, what we're seeing, not only in the countries that have been dealing with this for a much longer period of time, but now increasingly here in the United States, as our adversaries adapt their tactics, is that they're manipulating and co-opting authentic local voices, sometimes authentic American voices, in order to deliver their message and create an air of plausible deniability and make it that much more difficult
with their knowledge, or manipulating them without
sometimes yes, sometimes no. So there are instances where we know, for instance, in Ghana and Nigeria in March, a CNN investigation uncovered that money was exchanging hands between the IRA and 2 local PR firms and groups that were spreading disinformation. So that was with their knowledge. That again, they were targeting the United States and some countries in Africa. Sometimes it happens without their knowledge, though. So in the book, I tell the story of a local activist group here in Washington, D.C., that this is very appropriate since we're around July 4th time. On July 4th, 2017, staged a flash mob outside of the White House, and the Russian Internet Research Agency spent $80 in online advertising to get people to show up to that protest. And those activists had no idea until I contacted them and said, hey, was this you? Do you remember this? They had absolutely no idea that they had been in touch with the Russian troll factory.
$80, the price of entry to manipulate is so low compared to the possible implications of your manipulations. That's what makes this even more of a difficult threat to wrap your arms around. You mentioned the phrase that you've coined, whack-a-troll, play on the old whack-a-mole game. And essentially you see it as sort of treating the symptom, but not treating the disease. Mm-hmm. Fact checking, same category, the utility of fact checking. You don't think that does a lot?
I think fact checking has a time and a place, but the studies are inconclusive at best as to the effect of fact checking and whether it can change people's minds, particularly the people who are most vulnerable to disinformation. I think what I'm seeing a lot of nowadays, especially in American discourse, is if you link to a fact check or try even very gently to have a civil conversation about, this actually isn't true. Here's the link proving it's false. People will say, oh no, Snopes, PolitiFact, those are just deep state conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
So there are some people whose minds aren't going to be changed. And that's why I think, if people are going to get to the truth, they have to do it themselves. They have an investment in being right. And that's why, equipping them with the tools they need to navigate the information environment on their own, I think is going to be a lot more successful in the long run than just trying to link people to debunking and fact checking.
Yeah, there are actually a couple studies that show that people will double down on the misinformation if it serves their partisan goals.
Exactly.
And that fact checking has the complete opposite effect that you would hope it would. So about this evolving threat, the nature of the threat, even from the time you became immersed in the topic until you wrote the book, talk to us about what are the most challenging evolutionary steps in trying to sort through this threat? Things like deep fakes or image manipulation. How and you talk about fact checking and the negative impact that it can have, but then there's things has been called the Fox effect. We've never quite had a news network like Fox News in the United States, which sometimes looks like Pravda used to look in the old Soviet Union. And then you talk about politicians who abuse their megaphone for partisan purposes. Can you talk about the evolution of the threat and how heavy the lift is as we attempt to address it?
Sure. So I am probably an outlier in terms of disinformation specialists, although I think deep fakes and image manipulation, those are threats, certainly. I'm a lot less worried about them than I am worried about the, and I didn't coin this term, but I love it, cheap fakes that we're still seeing circulating on the internet, whether that's a misattributed image or just a misleading statement coming from someone with a very large megaphone. That sort of stuff is still having a disproportionate effect on our discourse. And it's really, really hard to push back against that. And that's why, some of the work we've been doing at the Wilson Center is trying to equip politicians and elected officials with the language that they need, not only to push back against disinformation, but to really educate their constituents in a nonpartisan way about what the nature of the threat is. But that being said, I think there's a huge responsibility on elected officials and anyone running for office not to engage in these tactics, to recognize them for what they are, and the fact that they're endangering democracy and the very system that they're relying on to be elected when they're using them. So that's the most worrisome thing to me, particularly as we see our adversaries adapting to manipulate local voices, because then, especially here in the United States, we run into free speech concerns. I don't want platforms to be taking content offline. I don't think that that's very productive. It just fuels more conspiracy theories about who they work for and what their goals are. I would just want to see more transparency. Why am I being targeted with a certain piece of content? How did they get that information? Why is a certain group being suggested to me, for instance? All of this stuff is really important. And the more information we can give people, the more easy it is to access that information. Then, I think we're going to be creating a more informed electorate, which is ultimately what everyone wants. And
are you essentially, I'm sorry, Nina, go ahead.
It's not a partisan issue.
Yeah. And are you saying that the algorithms are the real enemy?
They are a huge part of the problem. And one of the reasons that Russian disinformation in particular has been so successful, it's not because, just the internet allows things to travel farther and faster. It's because any bad actor, anyone with a social media account and a credit card, or even just knowledge of how to manipulate the platforms and their algorithms, can target the most vulnerable people with the message they will be most vulnerable to. And they can, cultivate community and trust over time so that year after year, as these communities are being created, you can just pile on bigger and bigger asks. That was the strategy of the IRA in 2016. And now we have a lot more closed spaces on the internet in terms of Facebook groups and encrypted messengers that can be manipulated the exact same way with even less oversight than we had before. So yeah, the platforms are absolutely playing a large role in this, and their commitment to their bottom line over their commitment and democratic duty to the countries that allowed them to exist, I think really needs to be weighed. And we're seeing some of that reckoning happening right now as advertisers are pulling off of Facebook in particular in relation to their response to content moderation and hate speech on the platform.
Do you have hope that those kinds of interventions by the private sector, and then the moves that the platforms themselves have made, do you have hope that this can lead to the kind of change necessary to really tackle the problem?
I don't think it's going to be enough. And personally, other folks have said this, and I certainly agree. I don't feel comfortable trading one corporate entity for another in terms of internet governance. I think we need the government to step in. We are abdicating our duty as the United States right now to set a democratic standard with human rights at its core for social media governance. I think we need to establish new rules of the road because we've never done this before. And the fact that social media governance is spread out over the FEC, the FCC, and the FTC among a host of congressional committees, it's a problem. We really need to put some bumpers on this bowling alley before things get too out of hand. And as I said before, we're abdicating our duty to all the other users of Facebook, of Twitter, of all of these entities around the world. 90% of Facebook's users are outside of the Western world of the United States, and they don't have nearly as powerful of a legislator or a lobbying entity to really get these platforms to heal. Sometimes they can't even get an audience with Facebook executives. I've been in rooms with many of those governments, and we need to stand up for them as well, and stand up for the ideals of freedom of expression that we hold so dear.
How do you respond to critics who say, "Hey, look, the U.S. interferes too. We don't have a clean record when it comes to meddling in elections or whatever it is that we might do"?
That's a great question. I remember when you and I first got to know each other and you had me come speak to some of your colleagues at a lunch, I was asked the very same thing. And I've had a lot of time to think about it. I started my career in an organization that does democracy support for folks all around the world. I worked with activists from Russia and Belarus. And with the National Democratic Institute, we were always very clear about where our funding came from, what our aims were, who could sign up and come to our trainings. If someone from Putin's party, United Russia, wanted to show up to one of our trainings, we would welcome them. And that's the difference between what Russia has done over the past couple of years and what it has done in the past decade plus in Central and Eastern Europe, and what the United States does with its democracy support and outreach efforts that Putin would like us to equate, right? But it's very different. We are clear, we are transparent, we are open. Those are American values. And the fact that Russia has been able to misrepresent itself, to impersonate Americans online in order to manipulate our political discourse, that's something that every American should be against, no matter what political tack an adversary is taking. American elections are for Americans to decide. And we've not done, I'm again talking about the overt sphere, not the covert sphere. Every country has spying agencies, right? That's not what we're discussing here. This is overt manipulation. And we shouldn't stand for that sort of lack of transparency in our own political processes.
And what do you know? We are in an election cycle. Should we expect the worst?
I'm not very optimistic right now. I think we are indeed losing the information war if we continue on this track of, politicizing common sense, low-hanging fruit regulation like the Honest Ads Act, for instance, which would bring transparency to political advertising online and bring it up to the same standards that we have on radio, TV, and print. That is a clear example of an abdication of our duty to Americans. We also don't have quorum at the FEC right now. Just this week from the National Defense Authorization Act, there was a provision removed about declaring foreign help being given to campaigns. I mean, all of these are very bad indications, and we've not made the same, the necessary investments in election infrastructure that I'd like to see. Not to mention that, you know, we have politicians, as was clear as day during the impeachment proceedings, who are happy to share disinformation that not only supports Russia, but supports other adversaries around the world. And I think we need to be very clear that that just leaves us vulnerable to future manipulation. And in addition to all of that, we're more polarized than ever before. People can't seem to find common ground, even about simple medical advice related to the coronavirus crisis. So yeah, I'm not particularly optimistic. That being said, I think, you know, there's room for individuals to play a role in this ecosystem in you know, absence of our government taking the necessary steps. I think the more we can have civil conversations with one another, and sometimes that means taking them offline. Sometimes that means, you know, if you can't do it in Facebook comments or on a Twitter thread, take it to a direct message. We can't have a beer together anymore, unfortunately, but you know, take it to a phone call, a video call, try to have those human interactions and approach people from a place of understanding. If you think that there is, you know, some common ground to be had there. Obviously with some people online, that is totally impossible, but the more we can slow down and be responsible about our sharing and interactions online, I think we can return at least to some sort of civility.
Well, it is difficult to be optimistic in the short term, but looking long term, a phrase you use in the book is grand strategy juxtaposed with whack-a-trol. That you suggest that grand strategy is what we need, not whack-a-trol. And you describe it as a generational investment. Just quickly, if you could, describe what that looks like, what this grand strategy, this big solution looks like.
Well, in addition to the media and civic literacy that I talk about a lot throughout the book, I think we need investments in regulation, as I've already touched on, but one thing we've not really talked about today is investments in public media. And this is something that I really, really strongly believe in. At the end of the book, I talk a little bit about the UK, for instance, and its investments in the BBC. Of course, you know, Brits paid a licensing fee to get the BBC in their homes, and it's probably more than many Americans would want to pay per year. But we, America, spends $3 per person per year on our Corporation for Public Broadcasting. With the BBC, Brits have, I think, around 60% of Brits trust the BBC in a time of crisis, and I can't think of another media outlet that Americans would place trust in here at home. Not PBS, not NPR, which have also been politicized by the Trump administration, unfortunately, even though they just do cut and dry journalism. That is a public service. And I think, you know, we need a standard for journalism as a public service, and we should be investing in that, not only because it fights disinformation, but in many places across the country, NPR and PBS are the only stations in certain news deserts. They are bringing people in, you know, our heartland, the news, because they don't have a local paper anymore. They don't have a local TV station anymore. I think that is critical at this time of so much information proliferation. We really need to be investing in that. So media and civic literacy, we need the regulation, and we need our politicians to understand that this is a threat. And then investments in journalism are key to winning the information war in the long run.
And on the line, the value of truth itself. So Nina, thank you for your efforts in that regard. One review of your book called it essential reading. Let me second that. Terrific book. It needs to be on everyone's bookshelf. The book is called How to Lose the Information War. The author is Nina Jankowicz. Nina, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, John.
I want to thank our viewers and listeners for joining us as well, and hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.